Hello, and welcome to the Feet on the Soil podcast, the podcast about the world beneath our feet and how we interact with it. Now that we're deep into summer, with long days and warm evenings, I've started to blow the dust off my old running shoes, get the laces tied up, and get back out into the hills. I used to love running. I used to run almost every day, and my favourite part of it was just getting outdoors. I honestly was never really a fan of the first 20 minutes of a run because that meant just going on paths and roads, and it was only after that first 20 minutes when I really felt like I was getting into it. I'd be amongst trees or up in the hills or down by the lake, but wherever I was, I felt like I had finally kind of reached the destination once I was there. But I'll be the first to admit that it can be hard to keep your mind busy while on a run. I know for some people that's not really the point and you want to keep your mind empty, but for me, I had to do something to stay engaged, and usually that was me coming up with little games. One of my favourite things to do was to imagine all the people who ran or passed through a place before me. Try to picture what the landscape would have been like. Was that field always there? Was there a house there? What was that ruin? What animals and plants they would have passed? Would it be the same small orchids that I see? Would there have been deer in this area, or would they have been chased off by boar? What was the reason for their run or their passing through? Were they collecting water from the river, washing their clothes in it, or even down fishing? And what was the world that they passed through like? On a recent run, I found myself on a path I frequently jog along. I'd consider myself to know it quite well, and when I looked up onto the hillside, I saw something that I knew to be out of place. Among the familiar fields and the odd one-off house dropped down amongst them, I saw a castle. And it wasn't a ruined castle or a pile of rubble, but a fine square watchtower with ivy climbing its stone walls that looked over the valley, keeping those within it safe from invaders. While I'm not exactly an expert in the history of this valley, I know it well enough to know that this castle does not exist. There is records of a castle further down the valley, but on this side, there is absolutely nothing to indicate a castle has ever been there. I shook my head at it, trying to get past this false memory, but each time I looked up, I could see it there, as clear as any other structure, until eventually it began to shimmer out of this existence. Was the castle physically real? Probably not. Definitely not. Was it a memory from a long-deceased ancestor? I don't know, but for a few minutes, it stood there, I stood there, among other relics of times gone by. And the moment got me thinking about that hillside, about the generations of farming supported by its soils, about the trees that stood there long before humans cleared them, about the animal inhabitants that called this extinct forest home. That led me even further down the proverbial rabbit hole as I remembered the Irish name for this area is Glenasmole, or in Irish, Glosha na Muiche, the stream of the pigs. The stream still flows down that hill, but there are definitely no pigs, but maybe at one time this area held a population of boar, ruffling up the forest floor with their snout in search of some sustenance. And every prey needs its predator, and the hill behind it is See Finn, the seat of Fianna, a legendary Irish warrior in our mythology who once hunted everything from Irish elk to boar and often more mythical beasts in the area before having feasts with his clan of kinsmen atop that very hill. Many things in a landscape can hold clues and keys to understanding its history a little bit more. These can be as physical as a small undulation in a grassland, indicating ancient farming techniques, or they can be a bit more metaphysical, like the name of an area or the castle that appeared on my run. All of this is to say, in the world we find ourselves in, one of increased disconnection from the old ways, one where farming can be done from the cabin of a tractor that would have seemed as far-fetched as a spaceship to someone just 3 generations ago, where our primary means of getting outdoors is through well-maintained paths and parks and trails, and a world where berries are picked from shelves instead of bushes, Sometimes it can be beneficial to look back and see how generations past interacted with and managed the landscape. Whether this is to learn from their successes or mistakes, or just to increase our enjoyment when outdoors. Today, we will explore how our perceptions of the past can help us to read the present, how we can view a landscape not just as this non-living thing that's always been the way it is, but as a storybook that we can learn to read and understand that bit more. When we look at a hillside or a field, it can feel like it's always looked that way. But the land is layered. It's shaped, scraped, and scarred by everything that's happened to it. Just like us, it holds memory, and if we know how to read it, it can speak to us. Looking at the land around us now, it can be easy to assume that our local town or city was always there, that the ground was always tarmacked and covered in concrete, that sheep always grazed the field down the road, and that the bogs were always a bit dry in the summer. But what was it like centuries ago or generations ago? One of the times that I really had an experience that I felt the kind of landscape speak to me was when I decided to climb Fianna, a hill in the Bornabrina area, and one that always felt a little bit kind of inaccessible to me. I used to walk around the reservoir a lot, but the hills to either side of it almost felt like walls that were in the background and not something for me to access. But one day, during the summer, on a particularly nice day, I decided that I was going to surmount this hill. I put on my funky-looking barefoot shoes, put some gels into my running vest, and set out the door. And like I said at the start, the first 20 minutes I never enjoy. That was just heading up the road towards the trailhead. I first crossed over the bridge of the Dodder, past the entrance to the Bornabrina Reservoir, and then up a very scary hill where large trucks come down from the quarry carrying stone. And then I reached my first landmark, and that was the stone cross. I don't know exactly when it was put there, but it looks equally ancient and modern and is a kind of good indicator for what's to come. After passing the stone cross, things got markedly more rural. Fields got bigger and houses got fewer and further between, and some of the fields that I passed held very cool stories that I'm going to talk about in a bit. But one of the things that stood out the most was just as I came around the corner from that stone cross, I could hear a kind of a croaking noise, and as I looked to my left, I saw a raven atop one of the trees. Ravens aren't exactly uncommon in this area, but this was one of the first times in a long time that I had seen one. And while in the past I maybe would have taken this as a bad omen, something inside me told me that this was a good thing and to carry on going. So I continued on up the road until I reached the gates to the Fianna trailhead. At this point, I can't lie, I was already a little bit out of breath, and as I began to go up, the trail got even more difficult. Going from tarmac to quite small gravel, all the way up to some large rocks, to what felt almost like the stream bed of a waterfall. It got a lot steeper, the rocks got a lot looser, and the trees got a lot closer in. Until finally, all of this gave way to bare mountainside. As I ran up, I was looking to either side of me, seeing the Glenasmole lakes down to my right and the wide expanse of Wicklow down to my left. Until finally, I summited the hill and saw the old tomb that sits atop Fianna. For a moment, I just stared at it, and the one thing I couldn't get out of my head was, why would someone build it up here? The hill isn't exactly Mount Everest, but it's not exactly easy to get up either, and to drag those large stones up, even if it was just from a adjoining hilltop, would have been quite the task. When these people needed to live every day worrying about where their next water source was, where their next animal to kill was, where their next plant to forage was, they took the time out to build this tomb atop a hill. I think that's real reverence. The hill, of course, is beautiful to look at. It's incredible to see, but never have I thought about ritualizing it. And I don't know if this tomb was used for burials or rituals, but obviously it held a huge importance to people. With the hill being that important and the amount of work being put into it, I feel one would be far less likely to do something destructive to it. Unfortunately, on the top of the hill at that day, I could see drinks cans and wrappers of various sweets on the ground. I feel that wouldn't have been done if someone had to drag even just one of those stones to the top of the hill. While these tombs, of course, held many different meanings in many different places, I believe that one of them was to kind of give yourself over to the landscape. It was a kind of a service to the hill. You were putting a crown atop its head, and in doing so, you would learn to respect it far more. Not everything has to be so metaphysical, though. Like I said, as I passed through the fields on the way up to the hill, I noticed something in the fields. They were lumpy, is the only word. It kind of stuck in my head for a long time, and one day I found myself on a kind of community tour through the Glenasmole Valley, and there was one particularly educated gentleman there who informed me that these were lazy beds. Lazy beds were a method of farming marginal land where sods of turf were dug up, flipped over, and this would create trenches and then large mounds. The mounds would eventually drain of their excess moisture and could be used for farming, mainly for potatoes, but for various other vegetables as well. And while these have been used throughout Ireland for a long time, they became particularly prevalent during the famine. The famine, of course, was an incredibly difficult time in Irish history, and any land that could be farmed was farmed. Now, when I walk up the same path towards Seahan, I stop for a minute and look at these fields and imagine the back-breaking work it must have been to turn each one of these sods with very, very different hand tools to what we have now in order to just grow food to feed yourself or your family. These stories, while separated by thousands of years, are quite similar. It was a giving to the land, whether it was dragging the stones up the hillsides of Seahan or flipping the turf of the fields below it. It was a way of giving yourself up to the landscape, and in doing so, creating a bond with it that you're not really that likely to break. But it's not just human interactions that we can use to read the landscape. It's not just these kind of archaeological discoveries that allow us to understand what's around us a bit more. It can be the plant life and animal life as well. One of the most famous is the bluebell. Bluebells mainly only grow in ancient woodlands, and they are very, very slow to spread. So when we see these wide sweeps of bluebells under oak trees online, these are areas that have taken years and years and years to develop. Once the trees are gone, the bluebells can hang around for a little bit. So if you're walking through a woodland in a park and you see bluebells, particularly if they're Irish bluebells and not Spanish bluebells, you can be quite sure that this area has held woodlands for quite some time. Plants can also tell us about the soil beneath our feet. Certain plants are going to be a lot more hardy, certain plants are going to be a lot more sensitive, and these sensitive plants can tell us everything from the pH level to the clay percentage to the fertility of the soil, and even little bits about the history of that area. One plant that I find particularly interesting for this is rosebay willow herb, also known as fireweed and also sometimes known as bombweed. Rosebay willow herb is quite a striking plant. It's quite tall, almost growing as, I think, taller than me, about 6'1", 6'2", but it's also one that takes over in damaged lands, hence the name fireweed or bombweed. In the wild, it thrives in areas that were affected by forest fires, but during the 1940s and the Blitz in London, it took over houses that once stood after they had been bombed. Because of this, many poets saw them as this kind of colour in the grey, where a house had fallen and obviously very horrible things had occurred. This flower was still able to thrive. It was even used as a kind of a reference example in The Lord of the Rings when it grows from the campfire in one of the deep dark woods. And in all of this we see that land holds memories and it naturally wants to be a certain way. Now that way is not constant, it's changing forever, but the land knows what's best for it. Wetlands will re-wet if we drain them. Forests will regrow when we cut them down. And one of the most impactful versions of this that I've seen is the Dodder in Glenasmole. In the late 1800s, the river was dammed to create two big lakes. They were used to control the flow of water, to prevent flooding downstream and give a constant flow to the mills in the dry summers, but also to supply drinking water to Dublin, specifically Rathmines. Over years, the volume of the lake has decreased by about a third because the silty waters from the headwaters of the Dodder have begun depositing and filling up the lake. Because of this, you can see the natural shape of the river beginning to come back. I've heard from certain people that they've attempted to empty the silt from the lake by dredging it, and that it's never too successful. Nature is too strong for that. It will fight back and naturally wants to correct itself. Now, the river is not the same shape that it once was. It's not the same river it once was. But the land knows that that lake is not supposed to be there right now. Instead, it's supposed to be a river, and it's fighting to become that. When we start reading the landscape in this way, names, shapes, stories, it stops being passive ground beneath our feet. It becomes a memory bank, a history book, a map of what's possible. And all of this, all of these little traces can tell us how to manage the land better today, which is where we're going next. Not everything was better in the past, and of course, we can all be a bit guilty of looking back with rose-tinted glasses. But it's undeniable that certain techniques of caring for the land allowed us to not only meet our needs, but also to meet the needs of nature in doing so. We can learn a lot from stories. Like I said, Fianna lived in this valley of Glenasmole, but if you're to believe every story, I think he lived in every county in Ireland. But what I find important about these stories is the hunts. Fianna and his band of warriors would go into a forest and within minutes encounter a wild beast, whether it be elk, boar, deer, or any other creature. I think these stories are trying to tell us that at one point there were many animals around, and now there are less. It's a showing that we're aware that things are going downhill, and this is dated back to as far as human memory can, and so is communicated through these stories. The once fertile lands where animals roamed free are now farmlands, and the animals are forced onto their edges. I think when we look specifically to the story of Fianna, we can see a bit of an analogy for an apex predator. Fianna was beyond a human. He was almost godlike, and because of that, stood atop the food pyramid. He was able to find any beast he wanted and defeat it. This is very similar to wolves, which hold such presence in the Irish mythology and are no longer on the island. Ever since I was a kid, there's been talk of reintroducing wolves back into Ireland, but I don't think it was ever taken as serious as it is today. At one point, it was simply a thing of, the Brits took it away from us, we'll put it back. But now we realise that the ecology of apex predators and ecology of fear is so important and missing in Ireland. Essentially, prey species like deer are able to run wild and eat whatever they want without any fear. The stories of Fianna as this apex predator show us a working ecosystem. He was never going out killing aimlessly and just for the thrill of it. He was killing to sustain. This is the mindset of something like a wolf or a lynx. And these apex predators are desperately missing in Ireland. Now, I've said it on record before, I don't know if I'd be too keen on encountering a wolf on one of my hikes through the Wicklow Mountains. I know, they don't attack humans that often, but I don't want to be the one that they do. But something like a lynx, something that is very rarely seen by humans whatsoever, but is well able to take down young deer and control those numbers, is something that's probably needed. I think that was the point of these stories, to communicate how a working ecosystem should be, how an ideal version of a landscape could exist. And again, it's not just stories that can tell us about the ideal workings of a landscape. Finding different archaeological aspects can tell us this as well. So things like timber-based structures or charcoal pits can tell us about the presence of a woodland. Even if the land is now open field, using historical maps, I found timber settlements in what is now land grazed by sheep. I think restoration efforts, specifically afforestation efforts, should take this into mind. In Ireland, all land will eventually become forest if left alone for long enough, but that doesn't mean that every landscape should be afforested. I think focus on places that have a history and a heritage of woodland should be the predominant factor in where we plant our trees. And the presence of these structures can even tell us what trees thrive in those landscapes. If we see that a house is from the medieval times and is mainly using oaks and has holly in the furniture, we know that those trees will thrive in that area. The other way that this can be used is in peat drainage. We can see where peatlands have been drained through things like ditch lines and shifts in vegetation, and understanding where bogs were tells us where they want to be again. Restoration projects are already happening inspired by these kind of thoughts. Things like the Repeat project, which uses these indicators as a method for planning where they will focus their efforts. And other projects too have been learning from the old ways. I was recently in Connemara on a trip, and we got to speak to some of the National Parks and Wildlife Services rangers who were telling us about some of the problems that are facing the national park. Some of the main ones are, of course, invasive species. It's hard to bring up the west of Ireland without bringing up rhododendron as an issue. But another one was the almost equally invasive sika deer and feral goat. These grazers are pretty indiscriminate about what they eat, whether that be young trees or eating grass down to the roots. In general, they are not very conducive to restoring landscapes. Instead, what we saw in Connemara was a small-scale project that used exclusion fences to keep out feral goats, feral sheep, and sika deer, and inside was some very low-level grazing done by some Connemara ponies, an animal that, as you can tell by the name, is a bit more adapted to the landscape and is less likely to cause huge amounts of damage. Now, having grazing in any scale is going to cause damage to plants by the very nature of them eating them, but in this way, you could see a difference straight away. Where the goats and deer were able to access, grass was eaten way down, peat was damaged, and there was no chance of any sort of tree regeneration. Where the conservation project was happening, you were seeing pretty much the exact opposite. Things were beginning to grow again. I believe there was even orchids in the field that you couldn't see anywhere else. And all in all, it just looked more right on the landscape. The past, in general, doesn't show us what once was. It offers us a blueprint for what could thrive again. In an area that's named after a certain tree, a certain animal, a certain landscape, the place is screaming in our face that that's what wants to be there. I think moments like that one I had out on my run of seeing that castle on the hill, while it might have been me not drinking enough water before my run, it could also be telling me something about the protection of this landscape. The castle is a representation. It's something that my mind created to tell a story, but in reality it means that this area is under attack and it needs something to protect it. Whether that be from encroaching development or whether that be from the sheep grazing the hillside, preventing any sort of regeneration, this hillside needs its protections. Like I've said, I think it's very easy to walk through a landscape and only see what's in front of you, to not think about how it was in the past. And I think it's quite easy to begin training your brain to see what was once there. I think one of the most fun ways and most interactive ways of doing this is through using old maps. You can either find physical ones, or if you can't find them, go onto something like the Heritage Map Viewer. Using this, you can see archaeological digs that have happened around you, but you can also compare the current map versus maps from as far back as the mid-1800s. By doing this, you can start to get a read for what the landscape once looked like. Now, obviously, this is all within kind of the last 200 years. If you want to go even further back, begin learning how to read the landscape. Look out for things like old tombs, look out for things like the lazy beds I mentioned earlier in the episode, and begin to learn your local history, learn place names, learn what they are in Irish and what that Irish translates to. Another thing to keep the interactive trend going is to download a plant identification app or buy a plant ID book. By doing this, you can first of all impress friends by knowing the Latin names for various plants, but also as you learn about plant conditions, you'll learn what a plant is trying to tell you. If you see something on a roadside that you know to be particularly hardy against heavy metals in the soil, then you know that this is a highly used road. If you see nettles in a corner, you know that that soil is quite rich in nitrogen. If you see rosemary growing in someone's garden, you know they're probably not doing a lot of watering. All of these things start to turn the landscape into words that you can read. And to be honest, you can have a bit of fun doing it as well. Nature restoration and conservation shouldn't be hard. The only thing that the landscape wants to do is thrive. The only thing that plants want to do is grow. And the only thing that's stopping them 9 times out of 10 is ourselves. By sitting back and listening, allowing the landscape to speak to us, and also not blocking it out, not thinking that it's weird and not thinking that we're going a bit crazy, we can start to kind of learn to kind of work with it rather than against it. And I think, in all honesty, this is something that I'm very early days on. It's something that I'm constantly trying to improve at. I look at people like Bobo the Bard, who's someone that I think is particularly in touch with the environment. I look at people like Einan Ilauva, who I think has a way of communicating with the environment and then with people that is really admirable. And especially people like Monkan Mangan, who have this ability to kind of relate different stories to different elements of the landscape and make connections that I can only really dream of. These people are real experts at reading the landscape, at listening to the landscape. But the more that I allow myself to kind of give into it and just accept that the landscape is trying to speak, the louder it kind of gets. So I hope you enjoyed that episode. I think it was a little bit of a different one. I've been a bit more focused on the sciencey side of nature and a little bit less focused on the hippy dippy side that I really enjoy as well. So I hope you did enjoy. I'm trying to get back to being consistent with this podcast. I think the last episode I released was 2 months ago with Catherine Cleary, which if you haven't listened, go back and listen to. It's a fantastic episode. Not toot my own horn, I'm just, Catherine Cleary is phenomenal, and it's definitely someone I should have mentioned in that listening to the landscape speak. Her documentary with Betta Bygart is fantastic, The Forest Midwife. If you can't see it, go see it. That's a true example of listening to the landscape speak. But yeah, hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you take something away from this week's episode, and on your next walk, maybe you too will see an apparition of a medieval building. But the main thing is, try and get outside today.